The sky above Europa cracked open like glass, and through it came a ship shaped like a dagger wrapped in shadow black, against the void silent and unnatural, as if it did not move through space, but carved a path through reality itself. Captain Elias Mayer stood on the observation platform of what remained of Outpost 17, its spires, bent like old bone, its walls scorched from plasma fire and impact debris, the place where his command had fallen in under 6 minutes against an enemy that had never revealed its face. He had seen ships gutted by invisible hands, men screaming as their thoughts turned against them, voices in the dark, calling out in perfect mimicry of loved ones dead for years, and when silence fell at last, the only sound left was the quiet pulse of the warning beacon buried deep in the ice. Now there was this ship, this thing that did not broadcast any signal, did not respond to hails, did not match any known profile in the interstellar codex, and Elias knew without doubt it did not belong to any human registry. It came closer, hovering directly above the central ruin, then descending in a shaft of dull violet light, and from that light stepped a figure tall and humanoid, with skin that shimmered like oil over steel, eyes that shifted between colors like fire beneath water, and a presence that pressed against the mind like static that hummed in frequencies just outside human range. The crew that remained formed a perimeter around the platform, rifles drawn but not raised, eyes darting to Elias, waiting for a command he did not have, because he knew without speaking that this was not a battle they could win, and not a moment to act in haste. The figure walked toward him, each step measured like a countdown to something ancient and irreversible, then stopped precisely 6 feet from where he stood. "I am Vera," she said, and her voice was not sound but thought, pressed gently but firmly into his mind. It carried weight, emotion, echoes of things he could not name, like distant thunder in a memory that was not his. Her face never moved, her lips never parted, and yet he heard her as clearly as if she stood within his skull. "You have fought well," she said, "and you have lost as was expected, for the enemy you face cannot be beaten with metal or strategy or hope. It devours all those things, feeds on them, twists them into its own weapons against you. And soon it will come in full, not as a fleet, but as a wave that leaves no identity intact, no thought untouched, no will unbroken. Join me," she said, "or face the enemy alone and die." Elias stared at her, saw nothing human in her stance, in her eyes, and yet something ancient and honest in the cadence of her words, something that whispered of war, beyond time, beyond species, something that understood what he had seen and survived it, and then survived again. Around him the wind howled over broken steel and shattered dreams, and above them the stars watched cold and indifferent, as a single question formed in his mind: did she come to save them or claim what was left? And in that silence, he did not speak, he simply listened, as the voice repeated, "Join me or die." They called her Vera because she gave no other name, no rank, no origin, no affiliation, and yet she spoke as if she had witnessed the birth of galaxies and the fall of empires, as if the stars themselves whispered to her secrets too vast for human minds. The crew stared at her with a mix of awe and dread, unsure if she was an angel or a ghost, or something worse. She stood unmoving at the edge of the landing platform, surrounded by debris and scorched concrete, the wind pulling at the folds of the strange material that draped her like living shadow. Elias Mayer watched her and felt the pressure of her presence like a hand wrapped gently around his mind, not squeezing but reminding him that she could if she wanted to. He remembered the stories, the classified files, the fragments of reports intercepted from broken colonies on the edge of mapped space. Words like mimicry, memory corruption, and cognitive collapse appeared over and over, sometimes followed by the phrase entity not identified. Now here stood a being who claimed to know the source of all that destruction and offered an alliance on the edge of extinction. She spoke again, not aloud but into the silence that stretched between them, as thick and tense as gravity. She said, "I was like you once. I stood at the threshold and believed knowledge would save us. But knowledge is not protection. Understanding is not resistance. The enemy does not kill, it consumes, it infects, it becomes you until there is no you left." Elias looked at his officers, the 6 that remained of the 20 who had stood with him just weeks before. Each wore the scars of the last encounter, not just on their bodies, but in their eyes, hollow and sharp and tired. Commander Voss had lost her brother on Ganymede. Her silence Since that day was louder than any scream, Lieutenant Reyes had been found staring into a blank monitor for 6 hours, muttering words in languages he had never learned. Now, they all stared at Vera and waited for Elias to speak. He asked one question: why us? She answered, because you are still unbroken, because you have not turned your minds against yourselves, because the enemy has tried to touch your thoughts and failed, and because you still ask questions, and that is something it cannot yet endure. It was not a compliment, it was a warning. Elias felt it down to the marrow of his bones, that they were not chosen for their strength or wisdom, but because they remained stubbornly human in a universe that had begun to unravel. He stepped forward and asked what joining her meant, what it required, and what it would cost. She smiled for the first time, and though her lips did not move and her face did not change, he felt it, a curve of intent across the mental bridge he had formed. And she said, it means learning to fight with thought instead of steel. It means defending not your flesh, but your memory, your identity, your sense of self. And it means the end of your old war, because the new one has already begun. And the enemy is already inside you. The ship Vera brought them to was unlike anything Elias Mayer had ever seen, not because of its shape or its impossible size, but because it was not flying. It was drifting through what should have been empty space, suspended above the gravitational hell of a collapsed system, known to cartographers as the Grave Spiral. It had once held 3 suns, now it held only silence, and a ring of broken planets spinning endlessly like monuments to failure. Elias stood on the command deck of his ship, watching the spiral through reinforced glass, and felt something in his chest tighten. This is where we lost the first war, Vera said, her voice slipping into his thoughts like a memory from childhood, where species older than yours tried to bargain with the enemy, tried to reason with it, tried to understand it, and all that remains of them is dust in orbit, and screams burned into the metal of the ruins you will see soon enough. The crew said nothing they had learned by now, that speech invited attention and attention could be fatal. They moved through the corridors of Vera's ship in silence. Light followed them like curious eyes, walls pulsing with something that was not quite electricity. Elias kept his hand near his sidearm, though he knew instinctively that it would be useless here if anything went wrong. They descended into what Vera called the core chamber, though it did not look like any chamber Elias had ever known. It had no walls, only void stretching out in every direction, with a platform suspended over nothing and a monument in the center, a jagged spire covered in carvings that shimmered and shifted like thoughts struggling to be remembered. This city was alive once, Vera said, her gaze fixed on the monument, and it tried to resist, but it did not understand that the enemy does not knock, it whispers, it does not attack, it invites, it asks questions and answers them for you. It makes you doubt, and then you make the rest easy for it. Elias approached the spire and reached out his hand, and as he did, the carvings moved faster, forming patterns, word symbols, and then images: a child standing in fire, a soldier screaming at his reflection, a mother forgetting her child, and then forgetting she had ever been one. He staggered back, and Vera caught him steady with one hand on his shoulder. The spiral is not dead, she said, it is dreaming, and in its dreams are warnings left by those who die trying to wake up. You asked what the cost of joining me would be. This is the first of many truths you must survive. The platform shook, but not from movement, from thought, from the sheer pressure of ancient despair pressing outward, trying to be known. The crew began to tremble. One dropped to their knees, whispering names not their own. Another began to laugh, soft and sharp and hollow. Elias looked at them, then at the monument, then at Vera, and said, "We are not ready." She looked at him with something that almost resembled pity, and said, "No, but you will be, or you will not be anything at all." They returned from the grave spiral changed, and though no one spoke of it, the change was felt in every step, in every glance, in every moment of silence that stretched too long to be normal. The crew of the Sparrow's Wake no longer joked during meals, no longer filled the corridors with idle chatter. They had seen something in that broken sky city that lived not in memory, but in the gaps between memory. And now everything felt thinner, stretched like glass about to crack, and in the middle of it all stood Vera, patient, silent, always watching with eyes that did not blink. Training began without announcement. There were no drills, no simulations, no orders barked across the comm, only a voice in their head, soft and insistent, guiding them into rooms they had never seen before and would never fully remember the next day, rooms that shifted as they walked through them, walls pulsing like breath, floors made of reflections that showed not their faces but their failures. Elias entered a chamber alone and found himself staring at a projection of Earth, not the real Earth, but one carved from his own mind, a place where time bent around guilt, and every face he saw was someone he had left behind: his mother, his first commander, his friend Marcus, who had taken a bullet meant for him and smiled as he died. Vera's voice filled the space without echo, saying, "The enemy finds you through your fractures. It does not break you, it waits for you to break yourself, then it steps in and becomes what you think you deserve." He tried to speak, tried to ask how to resist, but his mouth made no sound, because here sound did not matter, only thought mattered, only truth mattered, and if you lied to yourself, the room knew, and it grew colder. He remembered his failures with perfect clarity, the orders that sent civilians into a firestorm, the decisions that doomed colonies, the silence he gave in moments when he should have spoken up, and in that remembering he felt the enemy lean closer, not a presence, but a weight like gravity, like shame that became shape. "You do not defeat it by being pure," Vera said. "You defeat it by being whole. Even the parts of you that make you sick, even the parts that keep you awake at night, those are your armor if you claim them, and your chains if you do not." Elsewhere in the ship, Lieutenant Reyes screamed in a room that showed him his childhood and stripped it bare layer by layer, until all that remained was a boy left behind and forgotten by the system. Commander Voss relived her brother's last words, only to discover they had never been said at all, only implanted by the thing that had killed him and worn his face. Some cracked, some wept, some begged to be released from the ship, from the spiral, from the war, but Vera only watched and whispered to Elias that this was mercy, not cruelty, that the enemy would not offer time to understand itself before attacking. Elias emerged from the chamber covered in sweat, shaking but still himself barely, and when he looked at Vera and asked if he had passed, she only said, "The training has not begun." This was the introduction. The alert came without warning, a long pulse through the ship, not a sound, but a feeling like tension snapping in the air, followed by a visual feed from a probe sent days earlier on a recon sweep of a derelict vessel drifting near the Helix verge. It had once been the Vigilant Swan, a deep-range patrol frigate, lost with all hands 6 months prior, presumed destroyed in a meteor storm. Or perhaps worse, now it floated, silent, engines cold, beacon off, but lights flickering in rhythmic patterns that pulsed like breathing. Elias Mayer stood on the bridge and stared at the feed, his jaw locked as the camera panned across the outer hull, now covered in strange marking symbols etched into the metal like scars in flesh, and when the drone moved inside they saw movement, shadows sliding across corridors, too slowly to be human, too smoothly to be anything else. Then a figure stepped into view, a crewman still in uniform, smiling directly at the camera, his eyes completely black, and his mouth moving in slow, deliberate patterns, forming words they could not hear but somehow understood. "We are free." The phrase repeated across every screen, every console, as the image multiplied, echoing in ways it should not have. The same man smiling, the same message, eyes like voids, faces twitching slightly off like bad reflections. Vera said nothing at first, only reached out and tapped the main console. The feed changed, and now they saw the bridge of the ship, its captain seated upright, mouth hanging open, as if mid-sentence, fingers drumming endlessly on the arm of his chair, his skin pale and dry like paper, left in the sun, his eyes blinking in sequence with the lights around him. "He is not alive," she said, "and he is not dead. The enemy does not kill when it can convert." They boarded the ship with weapons ready, but minds sharper. The air inside was wrong, not foul, not stale, but too clean, like something had scrubbed the place of every trace of life, then put it all back in the wrong places. Reyes vomited as soon as they passed through the airlock. Voss whispered prayers she had not said since she was a child, and Elias walked at the front, pulse rifle, raised heart steady, his thoughts repeating one phrase over and over: "That is not them, that is not them, that is not them." They moved through bloodless corridors where pictures of smiling families turned to static when looked at directly, where shadows moved when backs were turned and doors closed without sound, and always the smiling faces appeared projected onto walls, onto consoles, onto nothing at all, whispering in that same voice that came from no mouth. "We are free." In the medbay, they found what was left of the crew, not bodies, not exactly, more like puppets of flesh arranged into positions of comfort, one playing cards with a skeleton, one hugging the chair, one still brushing its teeth as if unaware it had no jaw. Vera stepped between them with reverence and sorrow, then turned to Elias and said, "This is what losing looks like." He nodded once and ordered the ship destroyed the moment they returned to the Sparrow's wake. No hesitation, no debate, because he understood now there are worse things than death, and the enemy has patience. The enemy did not come with a fleet, did not declare war or send a message. It came with silence, the kind that slides into the gaps between thoughts, the kind that waits until no one is watching, and then rewrites everything without leaving a trace. The first sign was subtle. The lights dimmed just slightly for 1.3 seconds in a rhythm that no one noticed except Vera, who stood from her place in the observation chamber and said, "It is here." Elias felt it before he saw it, a pressure behind his eyes like a headache forming from a memory he did not remember having. He turned to speak to Voss, only to find her gone, not physically, but something deeper. Her face was the same, her stance unchanged, but her eyes no longer held weight. They were mirrors, and when he looked into them, he saw his own reflection smiling back with teeth that did not belong to him. He reached for his weapon and stopped because he did not remember drawing it. But it was already in his hand, and pointed at Reyes, who had not moved, who had said nothing, but whose mouth was open, as if speaking without sound. And Elias heard a whisper, a voice saying, "Do you really trust him? Do you really remember what he did on Titan? Do you really think he would not turn to save himself?" Vera grabbed Elias by the shoulder and pulled him back, snapping him out of the thought like breaking glass, and whispered, "Do not listen. It will use you against yourself. It will turn every fear into fact, every doubt into doctrine, every scar into a door." Around them, the ship began to change, not in structure, but in meaning. The hallways lengthened when no one looked. The walls pulsed with memories that never happened. The crew began to see things in corners, in reflections, in each other. Voices called from behind locked doors, in the voices of lost friends and lovers, promising things they had never promised, begging for help they did not need. One crewman opened an airlock because he thought he saw his daughter standing there smiling with a birthday cake. Another fired into the medbay, convinced the walls were closing in and that the walls were breathing. Another tried to remove his own memories with a scalpel because he believed they had been compromised, and the enemy cheered him on in a voice that sounded like his own. Elias locked himself in the command chamber and stared at the blinking monitors, and for a moment he could not remember where he was, what year it was, or why he was afraid. Then he felt the cool presence of Vera behind him and her hand on his back, and she said, "Remember yourself, anchor to something real, something small, something no one else can fake." He closed his eyes and thought of the sound of rain on the roof of his childhood home, of his sister's laughter, of the scar on his left knee from falling off a bike. And in that moment the whispers stopped, and the ship went still, and the lights returned to normal, and the reflection in the console no longer smiled without reason. The enemy had failed this time, but it had learned, and it would return. The moment of calm was fleeting, as if the enemy had allowed them a breath before it tightened its grip again, this time not with whispers, but with presence. The Sparrow's wake lurched violently, and Elias was thrown against the console, his vision spinning as the lights flickered to a sickly hue, and the hum of the engines warped into a slow, undulating pulse, like something living, breathing beneath their feet. The walls shuddered as the ship itself seemed to groan in pain, and then the view screens exploded with static before resolving into something that was not space. It was a void blacker than the darkest reaches of the universe, a churning sea of thought where every star had died and every planet had been erased, not physically, but in the minds of the people who had lived there, in their memories, their histories, their souls torn out and replaced by something empty. The enemy had taken form at last, but it was not a form anyone could recognize. It was not a being nor a collective, but a presence, a vast ocean of ideas, feeding on one another like parasites, clawing through the minds of those who were not strong enough to resist. The images on the view screen shifted constantly, people screaming, cities burning, forests rotting. The faces of the crew flickered in and out of focus, showing versions of themselves twisted by the things they had done, the things they had failed to do. Elias could feel it in his bones. Now it was here, the thing that had been lurking just beneath the surface all this time. And it was hungry. Vera stood at his side, her face impassive as ever, though Elias could see the tension in her eyes and the way her body was braced, as if waiting for something. And then she spoke one word, a single command that cut through the storm of thoughts and settled everything into focus. Fight. The crew had no choice. They had already learned the cost of surrender, and now they learned the cost of resistance. Their minds stretched and cracked under the pressure, but in that cracking they found something that had been buried deep in their bones, something older than fear, something older than survival, something human. And when they gripped it and held it tight, the enemy recoiled. The battle was not fought with guns or missiles, but with willpower, with unity, with the sheer force of the human spirit, clinging to the idea that no matter what had been taken, no matter what had been rewritten, they were still themselves, and that was a weapon the enemy could not understand. Elias felt it in his chest as his mind burned with clarity. Every moment, every choice, every action he had taken in his life came rushing back, not as burdens, but as armor. His flaws, his regrets became strength in that instant, and as he stood there alongside Vera with his crew fighting against the enemy's whispers, he realized that humanity's greatest weapon was not in its technology, its armies, or its leaders. It was in its ability to remember who it was and refuse to forget. The enemy broke first, not because it was weak, but because it had underestimated humanity's stubbornness, because it believed that the human mind could be rewritten, but it never counted on the fact that some things could never be erased. When it was over, the void cleared, and the stars returned to their rightful places, but the Sparrow's wake and her crew were not the same. They were something new, forged in the fires of defiance, in the crucible of what it meant to be human. And though Vera stood silently at Elias' side, she no longer needed to say anything, because they both knew what they had done, what humanity had done, and they knew the enemy would never come back again. Not for them.